"Which one?" the matchmaker asked, her quill poised above the ledger. He did not look at the 10 portraits arranged before him on the desk. He did not glance at the lineage charts, the dowry figures, the miniatures painted by the finest artists in London. He looked past all of it, past the silk and the titles and the carefully curated perfection, and said in a voice that made the candle flames tremble, "None of them. Give me the one you did not show me. Give me the one no one wanted." The matchmaker's hand went still. "Your Grace, I do not understand." "You understand perfectly." His eyes were the colour of winter iron, and they held a patience that was more frightening than rage. "There is always one. The one the family hides, the one they are ashamed of, the one they did not think worth presenting. Give me her." What would you do if the most powerful man in England looked past every beauty, every fortune, every perfect pedigree placed before him, and demanded the woman the world had thrown away? If he knelt before society's cast-off and whispered, "I have been searching for you my entire life. Welcome back to aristocratic hearts, my friends. I have missed you. Before we begin tonight's story, tell me where you are listening from. City, country, time zone. I want to know. Knowing you are out there, listening alongside me, makes this feel like something special." Tonight's story takes place in the spring of 1844, during the London season, that glittering, merciless marketplace where families spent fortunes to parade their daughters before eligible men, and where a young woman's worth was measured in beauty, dowry, and bloodline. It is a story about a woman who had none of those things, and the Duke who wanted her precisely because she did not. But it is also a story about what happens when someone decides you are invisible. When the people who should love you most choose instead to erase you. And what happens when one man, the most powerful, the most feared, the most sought-after man in England, looks into the void where you were supposed to disappear and says simply, "I see you." This is where our story begins. The Pemberton family occupied a narrow townhouse on Curzon Street during the season. Not the fashionable end, but close enough to Mayfair that Lady Viola Pemberton could claim proximity to grandeur without the expense of actually achieving it. Sir Reginald Pemberton was a baronet of modest means and even more modest ambition, a man who had spent his life quietly managing a small estate in Hertfordshire, and who regarded the chaos of London with the weary resignation of a man who knew he had lost the war long before the first battle was fought. His wife, however, had ambitions enough for both of them. Lady Viola had been handsome once, and had never quite forgiven the world for allowing that handsomeness to fade. What remained was sharp cheekbones, sharp tongue, sharp eyes that could calculate a man's income to the nearest £50 from across a ballroom. She had given Sir Reginald 3 daughters. 2 of them, she believed, were investments. The third was an expense she could no longer afford. Georgiana was 21, golden-haired and dimple-cheeked, with the kind of practiced charm that could make a man feel he was the only person in the room. Letitia was 19, dark-haired and ethereal, with a talent for the pianoforte that her mother deployed like artillery at every social gathering. They were, in Lady Viola's estimation, her best hope of climbing the social ladder she had spent her entire married life clinging to. And then there was Clementine. Clementine was 23. She had her father's quiet brown eyes and her mother's angular cheekbones, but where those features combined in Lady Viola to create something striking. In Clementine, they produced something that polite society could only describe as interesting. She was not ugly. She was worse. She was unremarkable. In a world that demanded women be either beautiful or invisible, Clementine had been assigned the latter category before she had ever been given the chance to prove otherwise. Sir Reginald's income of £1,200 a year was respectable but not generous, and the cost of launching 3 daughters was ruinous. Choices had to be made. Lady Viola had made hers. Georgiana and Letitia would attend every ball, every dinner, every event the season offered. They would wear the new gowns. They would ride in the carriage. Clementine would stay home. Not officially, of course. Officially, Clementine was unwell. She suffered from delicate health that required rest and quiet. This was the story Lady Viola told to anyone who inquired. And very few people inquired, because very few people remembered that the Pemberton family had 3 daughters instead of 2. In truth, Clementine's health was perfectly sound. What was unsound was her wardrobe. 3 seasons-old gowns in colours, chosen to make her fade into whatever background she was placed against. What was unsound was her hope, which had died so quietly she had not noticed its passing. On this particular evening, Clementine sat alone in the upstairs parlour with a volume of Wordsworth, while her mother and sisters prepared for the Marchioness of Cheltenham's ball. She could hear them through the floorboards, Georgiana's bright laughter, Letitia's scales on the pianoforte, Lady Viola's voice issuing commands like a general marshalling troops. The house smelled of rosewater and ironing starch, and the particular desperation that accompanied every evening of the season. Clementine turned a page. She had read this particular poem so many times that the words had become less language and more texture. A familiar roughness beneath her fingers, a rhythm that matched her breathing. She did not feel sorry for herself. Self-pity required the belief that things could be different, and Clementine had surrendered that belief 2 seasons ago, when she had attended her first and only ball and spent the entire evening standing against the wall, watching other women dance, feeling herself becoming more transparent with every passing hour. She was 23, unmarried, unremarkable, and she had made her peace with it, or so she told herself on evenings like this, when the house emptied around her and the silence settled like dust. Now, it is important to understand something about the London season of 1844. This was not merely a calendar of parties. It was an economic engine of staggering proportions, a marketplace where human beings were the commodities and dowries were the currency. Families routinely spent between £500 and £2,000 on a single season, on gowns, carriages, townhouse rentals, flowers, food, and the endless social obligations that lubricated the machinery of aristocratic matchmaking. For a family like the Pembertons, with £1,200 a year and 3 daughters, the mathematics were brutal. Every gown was a gamble. Every ball was an investment, and every daughter who failed to secure an offer was a loss that compounded with interest, season after season, until the family's resources were exhausted and the daughter in question was quietly reclassified from eligible to surplus. Clementine was surplus. She did not know, could not possibly have known, that at this very moment, in a study lined with mahogany and the quiet violence of old money, a man who had been searching for her for 3 years was about to find her at last. His name was Percival Drake, and he was the 7th Duke of Beaumont. To say that Percival Drake was powerful would be like saying the Thames was damp. He was 34 years old, possessed of £42,000 a year, 3 estates, a seat in the House of Lords, and a reputation that made mothers clutch their daughters closer and fathers reach for their brandy. He was not handsome in the way that society understood the word, not golden, not dimpled, not charming. He was something else entirely, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same stone as his ancestral home, and eyes the colour of a winter sky before snow. Cold, clear, missing nothing. He had been the most eligible bachelor in England for 12 years, and in that time he had declined every woman who had been presented to him. Not rudely. Percival Drake was never rude. Rudeness implied emotion, and emotion was a luxury he did not permit himself in public. He simply looked, assessed, and moved on, with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had not yet found it. On this evening, he sat across from Mrs. Helena Whitfield, the finest matchmaker in London, a woman who had brokered unions between some of the most powerful families in England, and systematically rejected every candidate she had spent 3 months assembling. The first was Lady Honoria Cavendish, 19, daughter of the Earl of Somerton. No? The second, Miss Frances Ward Pembroke, 21, heir to a shipping fortune. No. The third, through the 10th, followed in quick succession. Beautiful women, accomplished women, wealthy women, titled women, each dismissed with a single syllable that cost Mrs. Whitfield another thread of her professional composure. "Your Grace," she said, when the 10th portrait had been set aside, "I have presented you with the finest young women of this season. If none of them, you have presented me with the women their families wanted you to present." He leaned forward. The candlelight caught the sharp angles of his face and turned them into blades. "I want the one they did not." Mrs. Whitfield stared at him. In 30 years of matchmaking, she had never received such a request. "I beg your pardon?" "Every family has one, Mrs. Whitfield. The daughter they hide, the one who is too plain, too old, too quiet, too strange, too poor, too ill, too something, the one they have given up on." His voice was steady, measured, completely controlled. "I want her. But why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. One did not ask a duke why. One simply did as he wished and sent the bill. Percival Drake looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, and somehow that made it more dangerous. "Because a woman the world has thrown away will understand what it means to be claimed, and I will know with absolute certainty that when she looks at me, she sees me. Not the title, not the fortune, not the power. Me. Now, I need to pause here and tell you something the Duke did not tell Mrs. Whitfield, because Percival Drake was not a man who shared his reasons with anyone, and this particular reason was one he had guarded for 3 years. 3 years earlier, at the Countess of Durham's garden party, Percival had seen a woman he could not forget. She was sitting alone beneath a willow tree, reading, while the rest of the guests paraded across the lawn in their social performances. She wore a pale blue dress, almost grey, and she was so absorbed in her book that she did not notice when the wind lifted the pages from her lap and scattered them across the grass. He watched her chase those pages with a joy so unguarded, so utterly lacking in the self-consciousness that infected every other person at that party, that something in his chest had shifted like a key turning in a lock. She was laughing. Her hair had come loose. Her hands were stained with ink. And then she was gone. He inquired, discreetly, carefully, through channels that would not invite gossip, but no one at the Countess's party could identify a young woman reading under a willow tree. She had been so thoroughly invisible that she had left no trace. He did not know her name. He did not know her family. He had only her face, angular, intelligent, alive in a way that no other face had ever been, and a single glimpse of the book she had been reading. Wordsworth, the lyrical ballads. For 3 years he searched. He attended events he despised, scanning crowds for that face. He collected books, Wordsworth first, then others, building a library for a woman whose name he did not know, on the faith that he would find her, and that when he did, he would want her to have everything. It was obsessive. It was irrational. It was the only real thing he had felt in 12 years of being the Duke of Beaumont. When he hired Mrs. Whitfield, it was not, as she believed, a whim. It was his last, most desperate strategy. The woman he had seen had been invisible at a society event, overlooked, unaccompanied, unremarked upon. If she was the kind of woman families hid, then a matchmaker who specialized in knowing every family's secrets would be his best chance of finding her. Mrs. Whitfield swallowed. "I shall make inquiries, Your Grace." "You have 3 days." She found 3 families willing to acknowledge their hidden daughters. The Duke of Beaumont rejected the first 2. A consumptive heiress from Norfolk and a widow's daughter from Kent. Neither face matched the one in his memory. The third file was Miss Clementine Pemberton, age 23, of Curzon Street. The daughter Lady Viola had not thought worth mentioning. Mrs. Whitfield had included a brief physical description, as was her practice: brown eyes, angular features, tall for a woman of a quiet disposition. Percival's hand stopped on the page. "This one. Does she read?" Mrs. Whitfield blinked. I could not say, Your Grace. Her family mentioned no particular accomplishments. Find out if she reads Wordsworth." The inquiry, made through a discreet conversation with a Pemberton servant, confirmed what Percival already knew. Miss Clementine Pemberton read voraciously. Wordsworth was her favourite. "Her," Percival said, and his voice carried the weight of 3 years of silence, finally breaking. "Send the invitation." "The invitation, Your Grace." "The Marchioness of Cheltenham's ball. Ensure that Miss Pemberton attends." He paused at the door. "And Mrs. Whitfield, ensure that she does not know I asked for her. I want to see who she is when she believes no one is watching. I need to be certain." The invitation arrived at Curzon Street on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by a footman in the Cheltenham livery. It was addressed, impossibly, inexplicably, to Miss Clementine Pemberton. Lady Viola opened it, as she opened all correspondence in the household, and her face underwent a series of transformations that would have been comical if they were not so revealing. Confusion, suspicion, calculation, and finally reluctant acceptance, because one did not refuse an invitation from the Marchioness of Cheltenham without consequences that even Lady Viola could not afford. "You will attend," she told Clementine, as though bestowing a punishment rather than a privilege. "I cannot imagine why they have included you, but you will attend, and you will not embarrass this family." Clementine looked at the invitation. Her name was written in elegant script, and for a moment she could not process the reality of it. Her name on an invitation to a ball she had been told she would never attend. "I have nothing to wear," she said quietly. "You will wear the grey silk." Lady Viola's tone made it clear that this was not a discussion. The grey silk was 3 years old, unfashionable, and the colour of resignation. It would render Clementine approximately as visible as the wallpaper, which was, of course, precisely the point. I want to pause here and tell you something about what it does to a person to be systematically erased. Clementine was not stupid. She was, in fact, remarkably intelligent, a voracious reader, a keen observer, a woman whose quiet exterior concealed a mind that never stopped working. But intelligence, in 1844, was not a quality valued in women. It was tolerated at best, feared at worst, and in Clementine's case, simply ignored. What Lady Viola had done, the deliberate campaign of neglect, the careful erasure of her eldest daughter's presence from every social occasion, the relentless message that Clementine was not worth the investment, had not broken Clementine. It had done something more insidious. It had convinced her that her mother was right. The Marchioness of Cheltenham's ball was held on the first Saturday in May, in a townhouse on Berkeley Square that blazed with candlelight, visible 3 streets away. The ballroom was enormous. Gilded ceilings, polished marble, crystal chandeliers that scattered light like frozen rain. 300 of London's most powerful families were in attendance. The air smelled of beeswax, French perfume, and the particular tang of competitive ambition that defined every gathering of the season. Clementine stood near the entrance and tried to remember how to breathe. She had been right about the grey silk. Against the sea of white muslin, pale blue satin and rose-coloured tulle that filled the ballroom, she disappeared. Women moved past her without seeing her. Men looked through her as though she were a pane of glass. She was a ghost at a party she had not been meant to attend, and the absurdity of her presence, after all the months of enforced absence, all the evenings spent alone with Wordsworth, settled on her like a weight. She found a pillar near the edge of the dance floor, positioned herself behind it with the practiced ease of a woman who had long ago mastered the geometry of invisibility, and watched. This was what she was good at. Watching. In 3 seasons of standing against walls and sitting in corners, Clementine had developed an eye for the mechanics of the social world that would have made a spy envious. She could read a marriage negotiation in the tilt of a fan. She could identify a fortune hunter by the way he held his champagne glass, always too tightly, as though afraid someone would take it from him, which they invariably would, along with everything else. She could predict which couples would be engaged by June with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. She noted that Lady Worthington's daughter was being steered away from the youngest Cavendish boy. Too little money. Too much ambition. She noted that the Earl of Stratton's wife had not spoken to her husband all evening, and that the Earl's valet had been seen leaving a milliner's shop in Cheapside, which suggested a mistress whose tastes exceeded the Earl's discretion. She noted all of this, catalogued it, filed it away in the vast library of human behaviour she carried in her mind, and told herself this was enough. That watching was enough, that a life observed was still a life lived. Georgiana was dancing her 3rd dance of the evening, her golden hair catching the candlelight, her laughter rising above the string quartet like birdsong designed to attract the most valuable mate in the room. Letitia was at the pianoforte, drawing a small crowd with a Chopin nocturne that she played with more technical skill than feeling. Lady Viola was circulating, her smile fixed, her eyes calculating the cost of each interaction, the way a moneylender calculates interest. No one looked at Clementine. No one ever looked at Clementine. And then the room changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a ripple of whispered conversation that spread through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Clementine felt it before she understood it. She looked toward the entrance and saw him. He stood in the doorway as though he owned it, which, given his wealth, he very nearly did. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with those winter-grey eyes that swept the room with the controlled precision of a man conducting a military assessment. He wore black coat, black waistcoat, white cravat, tied with the kind of severe elegance that spoke of old money and older discipline. He was not smiling. He was not performing. He was simply present, and his presence rearranged every calculation in the room. "That is the Duke of Beaumont," whispered a woman standing near Clementine's pillar, her fan moving rapidly. 42,000 a year. Unmarried. They say he has refused every woman in England. "Perhaps he prefers men," her companion whispered back. "He does not. He simply prefers no one." Clementine watched him the way she watched everyone, from the safety of invisibility, with the sharp, hungry eyes of someone who had spent her life on the outside looking in. She watched him greet, the Marchioness with a bow that was correct but not warm. She watched him decline a glass of champagne. She watched him scan the room with those grey eyes, passing over one beautiful face after another, without pausing, without interest, without... He stopped. He was looking at her, not near her, not past her, not through her. At her, directly, unmistakably, with an intensity that made the candlelight seem to dim around them. Clementine's heart stopped. Then it restarted, with a violence that made her grip the pillar. She looked behind her, certain he must be watching someone else. There was no one there, just the wall, and a painting of a horse, and the absolute impossibility of a duke looking at a woman in a grey silk dress. When she looked back, he was walking toward her. The crowd parted for him without being asked, the way the sea must have parted for Moses. Instinctively, inevitably, because some forces were simply too large to resist. He walked with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never been denied anything, and his eyes never left her face. He stopped in front of her. This close, she could smell him. Sandalwood, and cedar, and something darker. Something that made her think of libraries at midnight, and the smoke from a fire that had been burning for hours. "You are standing behind a pillar," he said. It was not what she had expected. It was not what anyone would have expected. The most powerful duke in England, looking at the most invisible woman in the room, and his opening words were an observation about architecture. "I am," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It is a very fine pillar." Something shifted in his eyes. Not a smile. She sensed that smiles were rare from this man and therefore precious, but a flicker of something that looked dangerously close to interest. "It is an adequate pillar. You, however, are misusing it." "Am I?" "Pillars are meant to support ceilings, not to hide women who should be dancing." Clementine felt the blood rise in her cheeks. "I was not hiding, Your Grace. I was observing." "And what have you observed?" She should have demurred. She should have blushed and stammered and said something modest and forgettable, the way she had been trained to do. Instead, because something about his eyes made her feel as though the truth was the only currency he would accept, she said, "That the woman in blue by the window is about to discover her husband is dancing with his mistress. That the gentleman in the red waistcoat has been watering his champagne with laudanum since he arrived. And that you, Your Grace, are the first person to speak to me this evening." The silence that followed was extraordinary. She watched his face, watched the way his jaw tightened, the way those grey eyes narrowed, the way something dark and hot flickered behind his carefully maintained composure. "Dance with me," he said. "I beg your pardon." "Dance with me." "Your Grace, That was not a request, Miss Pemberton." The ballroom seemed to contract around them. 300 pairs of eyes swiveled as the Duke of Beaumont, who had refused every woman in England, who had not danced at a public event in 3 years, led a woman in a grey silk dress onto the floor. I need to pause here and explain why this moment mattered. When a duke asked a woman to dance, it was a statement. When this duke asked this woman to dance, it was a declaration. The entire room understood that something unprecedented was occurring. Mothers gripped their daughters' arms. Rivals exchanged glances of disbelief. Lady Viola, across the room, went pale enough that her rouge stood out like wounds. The waltz began. His hand settled at her waist, firm, warm, absolute. She placed her hand on his shoulder and felt the heat of him through layers of wool and linen, and the careful distance she had maintained between herself and the rest of the world for 23 years. "You know my name," she said. "I did not introduce myself." I know a great deal about you, Miss Pemberton. That is either flattering or alarming. It is both. He turned her through the steps with an ease that suggested dancing was something his body did without consulting his mind. You are 23. You have attended 2 seasons and received no offers. Your mother describes you as plain and of delicate health. You are neither. Clementine missed a step. He caught her, effortlessly, his hand tightening at her waist, and continued as though nothing had happened. Who told you these things? Does it matter? It matters to me. He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she could not categorize. It was not the cold assessment she had expected. It was not the polite disinterest she had received from every other man who had ever glanced her way. It was hunger, controlled, disciplined, leashed, but unmistakably hunger. You observed 3 things about this room in the space of a minute, he said. You spoke them with the precision of a woman who has spent years watching the world from the outside. You wore a dress designed to make you invisible and stood behind a pillar to complete the effect. And yet, when I looked at you, Miss Pemberton, when I looked at you from across this room, you were the only thing I could see. The music swelled around them. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something caged. Why? She whispered. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled her fractionally closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her temple, close enough that the warmth of his body penetrated the thin grey silk, close enough that the scent of him, sandalwood, cedar, smoke, became the only thing she could smell. Because I have spent 12 years looking for someone real, he said, and you are the first woman who has not tried to be anything other than what she is. The waltz ended. He released her slowly, as though letting go required more effort than holding on. He bowed, a proper bow, deep and deliberate, the kind a duke gives to an equal. I will call on you tomorrow, he said. It was not a question. The carriage ride home was a masterwork of barely suppressed hysteria. Lady Viola sat rigid, Georgiana unusually silent, Letitia wide-eyed with delighted horror. Clementine sat in the corner with her hands in her lap, still warm from where his glove had held them. What did you do? Lady Viola's voice was ice. What could you possibly have done to attract his attention? I stood behind a pillar, Mother. Do not be impertinent. The Duke of Beaumont does not dance with women who stand behind pillars. He does not dance with anyone. What did you say to him? The truth. Lady Viola's eyes narrowed. I see. And what truth would that be? That no one had spoken to me all evening. The silence in the carriage was worse than shouting. Clementine watched her mother's face cycle through fury, calculation, and something that might have been shame, though it passed too quickly to be certain. He said he would call tomorrow, Georgiana said, her voice brittle. On her. Lady Viola looked at her eldest daughter as though seeing her for the first time and finding the view deeply unsatisfying. Then we must prepare. Georgiana, Letitia, you will be dressed and positioned in the drawing-room by 10. If the Duke of Beaumont enters this house, he will see all 3 of my daughters, not merely the one who happened to lurk behind a pillar. He did not ask to see all 3, Mother, Clementine said quietly. You will not speak unless spoken to, Lady Viola said, and you will wear something other than that grey silk if I have to sew it myself. He arrived at exactly 11 o'clock. The Pemberton household had been in hysteria since dawn. Flowers purchased, drawing-room rearranged, Georgiana and Letitia positioned with strategic care near the best light. Clementine sat on the settee in the same grey silk, because Lady Viola's threat to sew something new had dissolved in the face of the family's financial reality. His eyes found her immediately. He greeted her parents with minimum courtesy, nodded to her sisters with the disinterest of a man acknowledging furniture, and turned to Clementine. "Miss Pemberton, would you walk with me in the garden?" The garden was a modest square of green behind the townhouse, a few roses, a stone bench, a gravel path that took approximately 40 seconds to traverse. But for 20 minutes, it became the entire world. They walked. They talked. Or rather, she talked, because he asked her questions with the relentless precision of a man who wanted to know everything and would accept nothing less than the truth. "What do you read?" "Everything. Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, though my mother would be horrified to know it." "Wollstonecraft?" The faintest ghost of something that might have been approval. "What else?" "History, science, the newspapers, when I can find them before they are used to light the fire." "Your mother lights fires with newspapers." "My mother believes that women who read newspapers become disagreeable." "And are you disagreeable?" "Profoundly." There it was, a crack in his armor, not a smile, but the suggestion of one, the way a hairline fracture suggests the structural failure to come. "Good," he said. "I find agreeable women tedious." Now, it is important to understand what was happening here. In 1844, a morning call from a gentleman lasted 15 to 20 minutes, was conducted in the presence of family, and involved conversation so bland it could have been used to treat insomnia. A private walk in a garden, even a garden the size of a pocket handkerchief, was something else entirely. It was intimate. It was deliberate. And when the gentleman in question was a duke with 42,000 a year, it was a statement that reverberated through the drawing rooms of London like a cannon shot. By the time Percival Drake left Curzon Street that morning, 3 things had happened. First, Lady Viola had begun recalculating her eldest daughter's value with the frantic energy of a banker during a market crash. Second, Georgiana had retired to her room with a headache that was, in truth, a temper tantrum of seismic proportions. And third, Clementine had felt something she had not felt in years, possibly had never felt, stir beneath the careful layers of resignation she had wrapped around her heart. Hope. She hated it immediately. Hope was dangerous. Hope was the crack in the wall that let the cold in. Hope was the reason women like her spent their lives standing behind pillars, because they had once hoped for something better and been punished for the presumption. But his eyes, his voice, the way he had said good when she told him she was disagreeable, as though her sharpness was not a flaw to be corrected, but a quality to be treasured. She sat in the garden after he left, on the stone bench, with Wordsworth in her lap, and the ghost of his cologne still hanging in the air, and she allowed herself for the first time in years to want something. The courtship that followed defied every convention Lady Viola had spent her life mastering, and it drove her to the edge of madness. The Duke of Beaumont called on Clementine 3 times that week. Each visit followed the same pattern. His carriage would arrive at precisely the appointed hour. He would greet the household with the minimum courtesy required. And then he would turn to Clementine with an expression that suggested the rest of the world was merely scenery. He took her driving in Hyde Park on the second day, in a curricle so fine that passers-by stopped to stare. The afternoon was warm, the Serpentine glittering beneath a sky the colour of cornflowers, and Clementine sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart performing acrobatics that would have put a circus performer to shame. "You are nervous," he observed, guiding the horses with the effortless control of a man who dominated everything he touched. "I am sitting in an open carriage in Hyde Park with the most talked-about man in England. Nervous is an understatement." Would you prefer a closed carriage? I would prefer that all of London were not currently watching us through their opera glasses. Let them watch. His voice dropped half a register. I want them to. He sent flowers, not the polite arrangements of courtship convention, but specific flowers. Violets, because she had mentioned they grew wild near the Hertfordshire estate and she missed them. Honeysuckle, because she had described its scent as the smell of childhood. Jasmine, after their conversation about the conservatory at the Cheltenham estate. Each bouquet arrived with a card bearing a single line of Wordsworth, written in his own hand. She kept every card. She pressed every flower. She told herself this was dangerous, that hope was a luxury she could not afford, that men like Percival Drake did not truly want women like Clementine Pemberton, that this was a dream she would eventually wake from with bruises. But each morning, the flowers came, and each afternoon so did he. Lady Viola watched this campaign with the calculating fury of a general whose battle plan has been rendered obsolete. She attempted to insert Georgiana into every interaction, positioning her golden-haired daughter in strategic locations throughout the house, ensuring she appeared in doorways at precise moments, manufacturing opportunities for Georgiana to display her accomplishments. The Duke treated these insertions with the same polite indifference he had shown from the beginning. He spoke to Georgiana when protocol demanded it, and looked at Clementine when it did not, which was always. Once, when Georgiana positioned herself at the pianoforte and launched into a Mozart sonata timed to coincide with his arrival, Percival simply closed the drawing-room door, muffling the music, and continued his conversation with Clementine about the merits of Shelley versus Keats, as though nothing had happened. The humiliation was exquisite. "You will need new gowns," Lady Viola announced one evening, her voice carrying the brittle brightness of a woman who has decided to take credit for a victory she did everything in her power to prevent. "And your hair, we shall try a different arrangement. Something softer, perhaps. And you must practice smiling, Clementine." "He seems to like me as I am, Mother." "Men do not know what they like. That is what mothers are for." Can I just say, this next scene is why I love writing these stories, because what happened next was the moment everything shifted. The almost kiss happened in the conservatory at Lady Cheltenham's second ball of the season. A humid, glass-walled room filled with tropical plants and the thick scent of jasmine that made the air feel like warm silk against bare skin. They had escaped the ballroom separately. She first, drawn by the promise of solitude, and he 5 minutes later with the deliberate patience of a man who had been calculating her movements all evening without once appearing to glance in her direction. She was examining an orchid, a rare specimen, white petals streaked with violet, its stem arching gracefully toward the glass ceiling as though, straining for a sun that would not rise for hours. When she heard his footsteps on the stone floor, heavy, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who never rushed because the world rearranged itself to meet him on his schedule. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She had learned to identify his presence the way sailors identify a change in wind, by the shift in pressure, the alteration of the air, the way the space behind her seemed to contract and heat, as though his proximity had its own gravitational field. "You left the ballroom," he said. "So did you." "I followed you." "I know." He moved closer. She could feel the heat of him at her back. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that a deep breath would have bridged the distance. The jasmine and the heat and the darkness beyond the glass walls created a world that felt separate from the one they had left behind. Clementine. Her name. Not Miss Pemberton. Her name, spoken for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice, low, rough, stripped of every pretense, made her close her eyes. "Yes?" "Look at me." She turned. He was closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his grey eyes, close enough that she could count the pulse in his throat, close enough that when he raised his hand and touched her cheek, just his fingertips, just the lightest contact, she felt it in the marrow of her bones. "I have waited a very long time," he said, "for someone I did not have to pretend with." "And you chose the woman behind the pillar?" "I chose the only real person in the room." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His eyes dropped to her mouth. The space between them compressed to nothing, heat and breath and the thundering of her heart. The conservatory door opened. Georgiana's voice rang out like a bell designed to shatter glass. "Clementine, Mother is asking for you. It is most urgent." Percival's hand fell. His jaw tightened. He stepped back with the controlled precision of a man who is exercising every ounce of his considerable discipline, and Clementine felt the distance between them like a physical wound. The urgency, of course, was imaginary. Lady Viola had not asked for anyone. Georgiana had come hunting, and she had found exactly what she had feared. Her plain sister standing too close to the most powerful man in England, with his hand on her face and something in his eyes that Georgiana had never once seen directed at herself. It happened because of what Georgiana did next. Let me tell you what Georgiana Pemberton did, and I promise you it is going to make you furious. She went to Mrs. Whitfield, not to her mother, who would have been the conventional choice for family sabotage, but to the matchmaker herself, the one person who understood the machinery behind the Duke of Beaumont's sudden interest in a woman society had forgotten existed. But Georgiana was not stupid. She understood that the Duke of Beaumont was not a man who acted on gossip. Rumours would not move him. Tears would not persuade him. He was a man of evidence, of precision, of facts verified before judgments were made. So Georgiana provided evidence. She had spent a week studying her sister's handwriting. She had practiced until she could produce a passable imitation, not perfect, but close enough to survive a first glance. And she had written a letter addressed to my dearest P in what appeared to be Clementine's hand, detailing the terms of a secret arrangement, how Clementine had learned of the Duke's search through a servant's gossip, how she had engineered her invitation to the ball, how the entire courtship was a calculated performance designed to secure his fortune. "I found this in my sister's writing desk," Georgiana told Mrs. Whitfield, with tears that were precisely as convincing as they needed to be. "I did not want to believe it, but I cannot stand by while a good man is deceived." Mrs. Whitfield examined the letter. The handwriting was close enough to raise alarm. The details, the matchmaker's involvement, the ball invitation were accurate because Georgiana had deduced them from observation. And the letter's tone was damningly specific, suggesting an intimacy with the Duke's private arrangements that an innocent woman should not possess. The note arrived at the Duke's London residence that evening, Mrs. Whitfield requesting an urgent meeting regarding matters of integrity concerning a certain arrangement. She brought the letter. What followed were 9 of the worst days of Clementine's life, and though she did not know it, 9 of the worst days of Percival's. He did not simply disappear in wounded silence. That was not in his nature. The letter troubled him, not because he believed it immediately, but because it contained details about his arrangement with Mrs. Whitfield that no outsider should have known. The handwriting was similar enough to the cards Clementine had sent in response to his flowers that he could not dismiss it outright. And the cold, analytical part of his mind, the part that had protected him from 12 years of fortune hunters and social climbers, whispered that this would not be the first time a seemingly genuine woman had turned out to be performing. So he investigated. He sent his man of business to trace the paper the letter was written on. He had his secretary compare the handwriting against Clementine's genuine correspondence, the brief, warm notes she had sent thanking him for the flowers. He visited Mrs. Whitfield 3 times, questioning every detail, and with each day that passed, the evidence grew murkier rather than clearer, because Georgiana's forgery was good enough to resist casual scrutiny, but not good enough to survive sustained examination. On the 5th day, his secretary identified 3 discrepancies in the letter formation: the way the forger crossed her T's, the slant of her capital C, the pressure of certain downstrokes. The handwriting was similar, but not identical. Someone had copied Clementine's hand. On the 7th day, his man of business traced the paper to a stationer on Bond Street, the same stationer where Georgiana Pemberton had recently purchased writing supplies. On the 9th day, Clementine's letter arrived, and the moment he placed it beside the forged document, the truth was undeniable. The handwriting was different, not dramatically, but unmistakably, to a man who had spent 9 days memorizing every curve and stroke of both. The letter Georgiana had forged was a performance. Clementine's letter was real. He could see it in every line, the slight tremor of the quill, the places where ink had pooled because her hand had paused, the raw, unguarded honesty of a woman who had nothing left to perform. Meanwhile, Clementine knew none of this. She knew only the silence. Percival Drake disappeared. No calls, no flowers, no cards bearing lines of Wordsworth. The silence was total, sudden, and devastating. A void that swallowed the fragile hope she had allowed herself to feel, and replaced it with the familiar, suffocating certainty that she had been a fool. The first day, she told herself, there was an explanation, a matter of business, an obligation at one of his estates, something rational, something logical, something that had nothing to do with her. The second day, doubt crept in, cold and insidious, like fog through a cracked window. The third day, she stopped eating breakfast. By the 5th day, she had reread every card he had sent, every line of Wordsworth, every pressed flower, and begun the agonizing process of trying to remember if she had done something wrong. Had she been too forward, too sharp, too plain, too strange, too much or not enough of something she could not identify? By the 7th day, she had stopped asking what she had done wrong and started accepting what she had always known, that women like her were not chosen, not permanently, not by men like him. She had been a curiosity, a novelty that had amused a bored duke for a few weeks before he returned to his senses and remembered that he could have anyone. Clementine sat in the upstairs parlour and waited. And when the waiting became unbearable, she read. And when the reading lost its power to distract, she sat in the garden on the stone bench where they had first walked together and pressed her palms against the cold stone until the sensation grounded her. Lady Viola's satisfaction was barely concealed. "I told you," she said, not to Clementine directly, but within earshot, to Sir Reginald, that it would not last. Men like that do not marry women like her. Georgiana's triumph was luminous. Letitia watched her eldest sister with the guilty discomfort of someone who understands that an injustice is being committed but lacks the courage to intervene. On the 9th day, Clementine wrote a letter. She did not know if he would read it. She did not know if it would reach him. She did not know if the silence of the past 9 days meant he had discovered whatever truth Georgiana had poisoned him with, or if he had simply tired of the novelty of a plain woman who read too much and talked too little. She wrote it anyway. in the early hours of the morning, by candlelight, with the stub of a quill and ink she had to warm over the candle flame because it had thickened with cold. Her hand shook. The words came slowly at first, then faster, then in a rush that felt less like writing and more like bleeding. She wrote the truth, that she did not understand his silence, that she had no hidden agenda, no secret correspondence, no cunning plan, that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who read too much, talked too little, and had been foolish enough to hope that someone might want her the way she was. She wrote that she had spent 2 seasons learning to expect nothing, and that his attention had been the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her, because it had given her something to lose. She ended with, "If you have decided I am not what you wanted, I will accept that. But I deserve to be told, Your Grace, not simply erased. I have been erased enough." She sealed the letter with candle wax, gave it to the one servant in the household she trusted, Tilly, the kitchen maid, who had shown Clementine small kindnesses over the years when Lady Viola was not watching, and returned to her room to wait for an answer she was not certain would come. The letter arrived at Beaumont Hall at 3 in the afternoon. Percival read it, standing in his study by the window, holding the single sheet of paper with hands that were not entirely steady. He read it once, quickly, then again, slowly, then a third time, with his eyes closed, as though committing each word to memory, or perhaps to punishment. The phrase, "I have been erased enough," broke something in him that 9 days of cold calculation had not been able to touch. He arrived at Curzon Street before dawn the next morning. He did not knock. He did not wait for the footman. He strode into the house as though he owned it, which, given his financial power, he very nearly could have. And he stood in the entrance hall in his riding boots and his travelling coat, with rain in his hair and something wild in his eyes, and said to the startled housekeeper, "Where is she?" Clementine was in the upstairs parlour. She had not slept. She was wearing a shawl over her nightgown, reading by a single candle that had burned down to a stub, and when the door opened and he filled the frame, wild-eyed, cravat undone, looking as though he had ridden through the night, because he had... She stood so quickly that her book fell to the floor. "Your letter," he said. His voice was rough, cracked at the edges, nothing like the controlled instrument she had grown accustomed to. "Your letter said you had been erased enough." "I have." He crossed the room in 3 strides. He took her hands, both of them, bare, ungloved, his fingers closing around hers with a pressure that was just short of desperate. "I will never erase you," he said. "Do you understand? Never. I was given a forged letter, in what appeared to be your handwriting, claiming the courtship was a manipulation. I did not believe it, but I could not dismiss it without proof, because the forgery was good enough to demand investigation. I have spent 9 days dismantling that lie, piece by piece, and I should have told you. I should have come to you and asked you directly, and instead I retreated into investigation because investigation felt safer than trust, and I am sorry." "A forged letter? In my handwriting?" The colour drained from her face. "Who would—" She stopped. She knew. "Your sister. She forged the letter and brought it to Mrs. Whitfield. My secretary confirmed the handwriting discrepancies on the 5th day. My man of business traced the paper to a stationer where your sister had recently purchased supplies. And then your letter arrived, and the moment I placed it beside the forgery, the truth was undeniable. Your handwriting is alive, Clementine. It trembles and pauses and pools in the places where your heart was breaking. No one could forge that." Clementine's face went very still, the kind of stillness that precedes earthquakes. "You investigated a forged letter for 9 days," she said slowly, and did not once think to show it to me. The woman whose handwriting it supposedly was, the woman who could have identified the forgery in 5 seconds. You retreated into evidence and analysis and control because those things are safe and trust is not. She pulled her hands from his. I understand that, Percival. I understand it because I do the same thing. I retreat into observation, into watching, because watching is safer than participating. But you cannot build a marriage on investigation. You cannot love someone from a distance and call it devotion. At some point, you have to trust me, even when the evidence is unclear, even when your instincts tell you to withdraw. You have to choose me over your fear. The silence that followed stretched like a wire between them. She looked at him. This man, this impossible, infuriating, devastating man, standing in her parlour at dawn with rain in his hair and his composure in ruins. And she felt 2 things at once, a relief so vast it threatened to drown her, and a fury so hot it could have lit the candles. 9 days, she said. Her voice was quiet. It was the quietness of a blade being drawn. You gave me 9 days of silence. Do you know what I did with those 9 days, Your Grace? I convinced myself again that I was not worth choosing. I sat in this room and I dismantled every good thing you made me feel, piece by piece, because that is what I have been trained to do. My mother taught me that, and your silence confirmed it. His face changed. Not the cold mask, something worse. Pain, naked and undefended, in a man who had spent his life ensuring no one ever saw him vulnerable. That was cruel, she said. Not the investigation, the silence. You owed me the truth, even an incomplete truth, even an uncertain one. I know, and I will spend however long it takes proving that it will never happen again. If you want me, Percival Drake, you will have to earn me. Not with flowers and Wordsworth, not with carriages and gowns. You will have to trust me, even when it is terrifying, because I will not love a man who only sees me when it is convenient. You are right, he said, about all of it. I know I am. I will earn you. You may begin immediately. And for the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Beaumont smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the suggestion of one, but a real, full, devastating smile that transformed his face from something carved and cold into something achingly, vulnerably human. There she is, he said softly, the woman behind the pillar. I was afraid she might have disappeared. She does not disappear, Clementine said. She was simply waiting to see if you would come back. I will always come back. Prove it. The jealousy incident came 3 days later, and I need you to understand something about how these 3 days had changed Clementine, because the woman who walked into Lord Ashcroft's townhouse was not the same woman who had stood behind a pillar at the Cheltenham ball. Something had shifted in her. The confrontation at dawn, the moment she had looked the Duke of Beaumont in the eye and demanded to be earned, not merely claimed, had unlocked a part of herself she had spent 23 years burying. She was still quiet. She was still watchful. But beneath the quietness, there was now steel. And Percival saw it, and it did not diminish his obsession. It deepened it. Now, if you thought Percival Drake was intense before, keep listening, because what happened next revealed the full, terrifying depth of his possessiveness. And I have to tell you, it made my pulse race when I first wrote it. He took Clementine to a dinner at Lord Ashcroft's townhouse, her first formal appearance in society as the acknowledged object of the Duke of Beaumont's attention. She wore a new gown. Not grey, deep blue, the colour of a midnight sky just before the stars appear, purchased with money Percival had sent to a dressmaker, with instructions that were reportedly so specific and so exacting that the woman had wept with professional joy. The gown was simple in construction but devastating in effect. It made Clementine's brown eyes luminous and her angular features striking rather than plain. And when she descended the staircase at Curzon Street, Percival stood at the bottom and looked at her with an expression that stopped the breath in her lungs. "You are—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "You are going to cause a scandal. Because of the gown, because of you." Clementine was nervous. This was a world that had ignored her for 23 years, and she was about to walk into it on the arm of the most powerful man in the room, wearing proof that someone had looked at her and seen something worth adorning. What she did not expect was Lord Grayson Hale, the third son of a viscount, charming in the way of men who have nothing to recommend them but charm. He cornered her by the refreshment table when Percival was briefly engaged in conversation with the Foreign Secretary. "So, you are the woman who has captured Beaumont," Lord Hale said, his eyes moving over her, with the appraising interest of a man who has just discovered that an overlooked painting might be valuable. "I confess, I did not see the appeal, but up close," he stepped nearer, "I begin to understand." "You are standing too close, my lord." "Am I?" He did not move. Percival's hand closed on Lord Hale's shoulder with a grip that made the younger man flinch. No one in the room had seen him cross the distance. He had simply appeared, the way a storm appears, without warning and without mercy. "She is not available for discussion," Percival said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were absolutely murderous. "She is not available for examination. She is not available for anything that involves you standing closer to her than the length of this room. Am I understood?" Lord Hale paled. "I meant no offence, your grace." "I did not ask what you meant. I asked if you understood." "Yes, your grace." "Good. You may leave now." Lord Hale left. Percival turned to Clementine, and the rage in his eyes dissolved into something softer, not gentle exactly, because gentleness was not in his nature, but tender in the fierce, possessive way of a man who has found the one thing he cannot afford to lose. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well." He was harmless. "No man who looks at you that way is harmless." His hand found the small of her back. "You are mine, Clementine. I do not share." "I am not a possession, your grace." "No, you are the only thing I have ever wanted. The distinction is significant." The proposal came that evening, not the grand public gesture she might have expected from a duke, not on bended knee at a ball, not with witnesses and spectacle and the performance of romance that society demanded. Instead, it came in the carriage on the way home, with the gaslights of London streaming past the windows like fallen stars, and her hand in his, and the specific, intoxicating privacy of two people enclosed in darkness while the world moved past them, unaware. "Marry me." She turned to look at him. The gaslight caught his face in flickering intervals, illuminated, shadowed, illuminated again, and in those fragments of light she saw something she had never seen before. Not the Duke, not the mask of cold precision. The man, raw, certain, terrified. "Is that a question or a command?" "It is whatever it needs to be to make you say yes." She looked at him. "Ask me properly." He held her gaze for a long, trembling moment. Then, slowly, "The Duke of Beaumont, a man who had knelt before no one in his 34 years, who had refused every woman in England, who had controlled every interaction and every emotion with the iron discipline of a man who feared vulnerability more than death, lowered himself from the carriage seat to the floor, between her knees, took both her hands in his and said, 'Clementine Pemberton, I have searched for you for 12 years. I rejected every perfect woman in England because perfection bored me. And then I found you, standing behind a pillar, watching the world with the sharpest eyes I have ever encountered, wearing a dress designed to make you disappear. You are not perfect. You are better. You are real. You are the only person who has ever made me feel that I am real too. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life ensuring that you are never invisible again." "Yes," she said. The word came out like an exhale, like something she had been holding in her chest for 23 years. "Yes." And then came the danger. "Now, if you think you know where this is," going, "I promise you don't. Keep listening. Sir Cornelius Dent was a man whose debts exceeded his inheritance by a factor of 4, whose reputation had been destroyed by a gambling scandal that Percival Drake had exposed 3 years prior, and who blamed the Duke of Beaumont for every misfortune that had befallen him since, a list that grew longer with each bottle of brandy and each creditor who came knocking at his door. When he heard that Beaumont was to marry, he saw not a wedding, but an opportunity to hurt the Duke by hurting the one thing he cared about. It is important to understand here the particular danger that women faced in this era. A woman in 1844 had no legal recourse of her own. She could not bring charges. She could not testify against an attacker in most circumstances. Her safety depended entirely on the protection of the men around her, father, husband, brother. And when those men were absent, she was vulnerable in ways that modern listeners might struggle to comprehend. When Clementine stepped outside that concert hall alone, she stepped outside the entire framework of protection that her world offered her. It happened on a Thursday evening. Clementine had stepped out for air while Percival spoke with the Lord Chancellor about a matter of parliamentary reform. The night was cool, the street quiet, the gaslight casting pools of amber on the cobblestones. She stood beneath the portico, breathing in the clean air after the stifling heat of the concert hall, and she did not hear the footsteps until a hand closed around her arm and yanked her into the shadows between the building and the carriage house. "So, you are his weakness," Sir Cornelius hissed. His breath reeked of brandy. His grip was bruising. "Plain little thing, aren't you? Hard to believe you're worth all this trouble." "Release me." Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. "Tell your Duke that debts come due. Tell him that some men do not forget, and some men do not forgive. And—" "I said release me." Something in her voice stopped him. Perhaps it was the steadiness of it, the absolute refusal to tremble, despite the fear that hammered in her chest like a caged animal. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, not with the terror he expected, but with the cool, cataloguing precision of a woman who had spent her entire life reading people from the safety of corners and shadows. "You are Sir Cornelius Dent," she said. She had read about his scandal in the newspapers, the same newspapers her mother used to light fires, the ones Clementine rescued each morning before dawn and devoured in the upstairs parlour while the rest of the house slept. 3 years of enforced isolation had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of London scandals, debts, and social disgraces. "Your debts exceed £9,000. You lost your membership at White's in the gambling scandal of '41. You have 3 creditors who will have you arrested by Michaelmas." She met his eyes. "And you are currently assaulting the betrothed of the Duke of Beaumont on a public street. Which of these facts, Sir Cornelius, do you imagine will destroy you first?" Dent's grip loosened, just fractionally, just enough. And in that moment, Percival Drake materialized from the darkness like something summoned from nightmare, not running, walking, but walking with the coiled, lethal purpose of a man who has found the thing he was born to destroy. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply took Sir Cornelius Dent by the throat, pressed him against the wall of the concert hall, and held him there with one hand while the other reached for Clementine. "Are you hurt?" he asked her. His voice was perfectly calm. His hand, the one holding Dent against the wall, was not. "No, I was handling it." The faintest flicker crossed his face. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that said, "Of course you were." "I noticed, but I will handle the rest." He turned to Dent. "You touched her." "Beaumont, You touched her." The words were quiet, precise, each one a verdict. "I am going to destroy you. Not quickly, not cleanly. I am going to dismantle your life so thoroughly that your own mother will pretend she never bore you. But first—" He released Dent's throat. "You are going to kneel. You are going to apologize to her, and you are going to pray that she is more merciful than I am." Dent knelt, in the gutter, on the cobblestones, before a woman he had called plain. He knelt and apologized with the desperate sincerity of a man who understands that his life is no longer his own. Clementine looked at Percival. His eyes were blazing with a fury so pure it was almost beautiful. She put her hand on his arm, not to restrain him, but to anchor him. "That is enough," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "For you," he said, "it is enough. For me, it will never be enough." Within a week, sir, Cornelius Dent was financially destroyed. Every debt called in, every mortgage purchased and foreclosed, every social connection severed with surgical precision. Percival did not do this in secret. He did it openly, systematically, with the calm deliberation of a man demonstrating to all of England what happened when you touch something that belonged to him. The message rippled through the drawing rooms of London like a shockwave. The Duke of Beaumont's bride was untouchable, and the cost of learning that lesson was absolute ruin. Sir Cornelius left England on a merchant ship bound for the colonies. He never returned. I have to pause here and tell you, when I wrote this scene, the sheer scale of Percival's retribution took my breath away. This was not the hot-blooded rage of a jealous lover. This was the cold, methodical destruction of a man who understood power not as a weapon of impulse, but as an instrument of precision. He did not simply punish Dent, he erased him, the same way the world had tried to erase Clementine. The symmetry was devastating. The engagement was announced in the Times on a Monday morning, in the marriages column, with a brevity that belied its seismic impact. His Grace the Duke of Beaumont is pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Clementine Pemberton, eldest daughter of Sir Reginald Pemberton of Hertfordshire. Society lost its collective mind. The woman no one wanted. The woman who stood behind pillars. The woman whose own mother had tried to hide her, engaged to the most powerful duke in England. The gossip columnists exhausted their supplies of ink. The drawing rooms of Mayfair hummed with speculation, outrage, and the particular fury of mothers who had spent thousands of pounds presenting their own daughters, only to be eclipsed by a woman in grey silk who had not even been officially presented that season. "It is an outrage," declared the Countess of Rotherham, who had spent £800 on her daughter's wardrobe alone. "The Pemberton girl has no connections, no fortune, no beauty to speak of. What can he possibly see in her?" What he saw, of course, was everything the Countess of Rotherham could not, because the Countess, like the rest of society, had been trained to look at surfaces, and Percival Drake had spent his life looking beneath them. But it was Percival's revenge on the Pemberton family that demonstrated exactly what kind of man he was. And it was the kind of revenge that did not arrive like a storm, but like winter. Slow, inevitable, and impossible to survive. He began with the finances. Within a fortnight, Sir Reginald found his debts mysteriously purchased, not forgiven, but held. Every pound the family owed to tradesmen, dressmakers, the landlord of the Curzon Street townhouse, all of it now belonged to the Duke of Beaumont. Lady Viola found her credit at every fashionable shop in London suddenly and inexplicably revoked. When she attempted to order new gowns for Georgiana and Letitia at Madame Beauchamp's, the proprietress, who had dressed the Pemberton sisters for 3 seasons on credit that was already dangerously extended, informed her with exquisite regret that new terms would be required. Cash only, in advance. The message was clear. The Duke of Beaumont now controlled the Pemberton family's financial existence, and he would wield that control with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a hawk. Then he addressed Georgiana. He invited Mrs. Whitfield to tea, and over cucumber sandwiches served on Sèvres porcelain, calmly presented the evidence of Georgiana's deception. The forged letter, the handwriting analysis his secretary had compiled, the receipt from the Bond Street stationer, 3 witnesses, who had seen Georgiana visit Mrs. Whitfield's offices, and a signed statement from the Pemberton household's kitchen maid, confirming that Miss Georgiana had spent several evenings practicing her sister's handwriting at the writing desk. Mrs. Whitfield, horrified at her own credulity, struck Georgiana's name from her books. In the world of the London season, where a matchmaker's endorsement was the currency of marital viability, this was social execution. No reputable family would consider an alliance with a woman who had been formally rejected by Helena Whitfield for forgery and fraud. Georgiana's chances of a brilliant match, the only thing she had ever been raised to achieve, evaporated like morning dew. Then he addressed Lady Viola directly, at dinner, in her own home, with the entire family present, and the servants dismissed. His voice was conversational. His eyes were not. "You hid her," he said. "You took a woman of extraordinary intelligence and beauty, and you convinced her she was worthless. You dressed her in rags and told her she was plain. You erased her from the family as though she were a stain to be scrubbed out. You did this not because she was lacking, Lady Viola, but because her qualities shamed you, because her intelligence highlighted your ignorance, her honesty exposed your scheming, and her quiet dignity made your vanity unbearable." Lady Viola's face was the colour of old paper. Her hands trembled in her lap. "How dare—" "I am not finished." The room went absolutely silent. Even the candle flames seemed to hold still. "You will attend the wedding. You will smile. You will tell every person who asks that you are proud of your eldest daughter, and you will mean it, or you will be convincing enough that the distinction does not matter. And after the wedding you will retire to the Hertfordshire estate on an administered income of £200 a year." Now, I want you to understand what this sentence meant. £200 a year was, for a single woman in the countryside, a perfectly comfortable existence. It was not the money that constituted the punishment. It was the exile. Lady Viola's entire identity, her social climbing, her scheming, her relentless campaign to infiltrate the upper reaches of the aristocracy, required London. It required balls, dinners, calling cards, the Mayfair townhouse, the season. Without London, Lady Viola was nothing. She was a woman in a cottage, writing letters that no one of consequence would read, receiving no invitations, attending no events, slowly becoming the very thing she had made Clementine. Invisible. If I hear that you have spoken a single unkind word about Clementine to anyone, ever, for the rest of your natural life, I will reduce that figure to 100. And if you test me further, I will reduce it to nothing, and you will discover what it feels like to be the woman no one wants. Do I make myself clear?" He made himself clear. The wedding was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, the church of choice for fashionable marriages, where the pews were filled with every significant name in English society. Clementine wore white silk, simple and elegant, with no adornment, but the strand of pearls Percival had given her the night before, with a card that read simply, "Real. Always." She walked down the aisle, with her hand on her father's arm. Sir Reginald, who had never protected her from her mother's cruelty, but who wept openly as he gave her away, perhaps understanding at last what he had failed to see for 23 years. And at the altar stood Percival, not smiling, because smiles were still rare from this man, but looking at her with those grey eyes that held everything his face would not show, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms, that this was real. The vows were spoken. The register was signed. And when Percival kissed her, a brief, controlled kiss that nevertheless carried the weight of 12 years of searching, the congregation held its collective breath, because even the most cynical among them could feel the gravity of what they were witnessing. Now, it is important to understand what marriage meant for a woman in 1844 England. Under the laws of coverture, the moment a woman spoke her wedding vows, she legally ceased to exist as an independent person. Her property became her husband's property. Her wages became his wages. Even her children would belong to him in the eyes of the law. When Clementine stood at that altar, she was not merely choosing a husband, she was signing away her legal existence. But Percival Drake, in a gesture that shocked even his solicitors, had drawn up a marriage settlement that granted Clementine control of her own money, her own property, and her own decisions, a near unprecedented act that demonstrated precisely how much this man's devotion was rooted not in possession, but in respect. But it was the library that broke her. Beaumont Hall was vast, 200 rooms, grounds that stretched to the horizon in every direction, a staff of 60 whose names Clementine was determined to learn before the month was out. Percival gave her the full tour on their first morning as husband and wife, watching her face with the quiet intensity of a man cataloguing every reaction. She was impressed by the gallery, with its Gainsboroughs and Reynoldses hanging in gilt frames that caught the morning light. She was charmed by the conservatory, with its glass roof and the lemon trees he had imported from Italy. She was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of a life she had never imagined occupying, a life measured not in modest parlours and mended gowns, but in marble hallways and rooms that seemed to stretch forever. And then he gave her a key, a small brass key, unremarkable in appearance, warm from being held in his palm. He placed it in her hand and closed her fingers around it with both of his, and the gesture, so careful, so deliberate, so weighted with meaning, made her throat tighten before she even knew what it opened. "The east wing," he said, "third door on the left." She walked the corridor alone. He did not follow. He understood, perhaps better than anyone could have, that some revelations require solitude, that some gifts are too large to be received in company. The room behind the third door was a library, not the formal library of the main house with its leather-bound sets purchased by the yard and decorative globes that no one had ever spun, but a private library. Her library, built for her, floor-to-ceiling shelves of warm oak, a bay window overlooking the rose garden, a desk positioned to catch the morning light, a fireplace, already laid with applewood that would scent the room with sweetness when it burned, a reading chair upholstered in deep blue velvet, the exact colour of the gown he had bought her, a lamp with a green glass shade, a writing set with new quills and fresh ink, and on the shelves, every book she had ever mentioned wanting to read: Wollstonecraft, Shelley, Byron, scientific papers from the Royal Society, political pamphlets that polite society considered unsuitable for women, history, philosophy, novels in French and Italian, every single one. "How did you—" her voice broke. "How did you know?" I listened, he said simply. I listened to every word you ever said, and I remembered. Now I want you to understand why this matters. In a world that had told Clementine her thoughts were unwelcome, her opinions unsuitable, her intelligence a defect to be hidden, this man had built her a room that said, think, read, be exactly who you are. I built this for the woman you already were, not the woman the world wanted you to become. Clementine turned to face him. Tears were streaming down her face, and she did not try to hide them. 3 years, she said. Percival went very still. What? These books. Some of them are out of print, some were published abroad. The Wollstonecraft is a first edition. There are only 12 known copies in England, and I know because I have searched for one myself. You did not assemble this collection in the week since we met. She looked at him with eyes that saw everything. The woman who had watched the world from behind pillars, who could read a marriage negotiation in the tilt of a fan, who missed nothing and forgave less. You have been collecting these for years, before the matchmaker, before the ball, before you ever spoke my name. How long, Percival, how long have you known about me? The silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. The fire crackled and settled. And the Duke of Beaumont stood before his wife with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not control, not composure, not the careful mask of a man who permitted the world to see only what he chose. Something raw, something exposed, something that looked remarkably like fear. 3 years, he said. The air left her lungs. I first saw you at the Countess of Durham's garden party. It was a Thursday afternoon in June. The weather was warm. You were sitting apart from the others beneath a willow tree, reading in the dappled shade while the rest of the guests performed their social obligations on the lawn. You were wearing a blue dress, pale blue, almost grey, and you were so absorbed in your book that you did not notice when the wind scattered your pages across the grass. He paused. His voice had gone rough, like stone worn by water. I watched a woman chase paper across a garden with more passion, more genuine joy, more unguarded life than I had seen from any debutante in a decade of seasons. You were laughing. Your hair had come loose. Your hands were stained with ink, and I thought, she is alive. In a world of performances and pretenses, she is alive. He stopped. She waited. The fire crackled between them. And then you vanished. I turned to ask the Countess who you were, and when I turned back, you were gone. No one could tell me your name. No one remembered a young woman reading alone under a tree, because you were the kind of woman people did not remember. I searched for you for 3 years, Clementine. I attended events I despised, scanning every room, every garden, every ballroom for that face, and I never found you, because your mother had already begun hiding you. The season I saw you was your last. After that, you stayed home. The matchmaker, Clementine said slowly. You did not hire her to find just any hidden daughter. You hired her to find me. I hired her to find the woman I had spent 3 years searching for. I did not know your name. I knew only your face, and that you read Wordsworth, and that you were the kind of woman a family might hide. When her inquiries returned your description, brown eyes, angular features, a reader, I asked her to confirm one thing. Whether you read Wordsworth. His voice cracked, barely. She confirmed it within the hour. You built this library on faith, she said, before you even knew my name. You collected these books for a woman you might never have found. Yes? Why did you not simply speak to me? At the garden party, before I disappeared? His jaw tightened. Because I was afraid. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. Afraid? Of what? That you would look at me and see the title, that you would perform the way every other woman performs, that the Clementine I had watched from a distance, the real one, the one who read in the sun and argued with books and laughed when she thought no one could hear, would disappear the moment she knew a duke was looking. I needed to see you first. I needed to know that the woman I had imagined for 3 years was real. He paused, and I hesitated too long at that garden party. I hesitated, and you vanished, and it took me 3 years to find you again. I will never hesitate again. That was the night she understood the full scope of what had happened, that she had not been chosen on a whim or a fancy, but with the meticulous, obsessive, devastating patience of a man who had spent 3 years building a world for a woman he had not yet spoken to. Every book on those shelves was a love letter. Every title was a year of watching, wanting, waiting. "You terrify me," she whispered. He touched her face. "I know. I don't want you to stop. I never will." She reached behind her to the window seat where she had been reading when he found her, the volume of Wordsworth, her volume, the one she had carried from the upstairs parlour on Curzon Street, through every lonely evening of every lonely season, the one whose pages were soft from years of touching, whose spine was cracked in the places she returned to most. She placed it in his hands. "This is the book I was reading the night you sent the invitation," she said, "and the night you disappeared for 9 days, and the night I wrote you that letter. It is the only thing I have ever owned that felt like mine." She closed his fingers around it. "Now it is yours, because you are the only person who has ever made me feel like I belong somewhere." Percival Drake, the Duke of Beaumont, who had not wept since his brothers died, who had built his entire existence on the principle that vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was death, pressed his forehead against hers, and his eyes were bright, and his breath was unsteady, and he held that book as though it were the most valuable object in England. Which, to him, it was. 6 weeks after the wedding, the calling cards began to arrive. Women who had ignored Clementine for 23 years suddenly discovered her existence. Invitations to teas, dinners, garden parties, and charitable committees poured into Beaumont Hall with the relentless efficiency of a social tide reversing itself. Now, I want you to understand the irony of this moment. These were the same women who had looked through Clementine at every ball, the same women who had whispered plain and spinster behind their fans, the same women who had counted her among the season's failures and then forgotten she existed. And now they appeared at her door with calling cards and smiles, as though the previous 23 years of silence had been merely an oversight. Clementine handled it with grace, but not with ignorance. She received them in her drawing room, served them tea, engaged them in conversation, and watched them with the same sharp, cataloguing eyes that had first caught Percival's attention. She knew what they wanted: proximity to power, the Duchess's favour, an invitation to Beaumont Hall, and she gave it to them, selectively, strategically, with the quiet understanding that mercy and justice were not the same thing, and that the greatest revenge was not cruelty, but elevation. At a dinner party hosted by the Marchioness of Cheltenham, the very woman whose ball had changed everything, Lord Ashcroft made the mistake of quoting Wordsworth at Clementine with the patronising air of a man explaining literature to a child. "I believe the original line is somewhat different, my lord," Clementine said mildly, and proceeded to correct him with a precision that left the table in stunned silence and Percival watching her with an expression that could only be described as worshipful. "Your wife," Lord Ashcroft said to the Duke afterward, his voice carrying the bewildered respect of a man who has been intellectually outmanoeuvred, "is formidable." "My wife," Percival replied, "is everything." Georgiana came to Beaumont Hall once, 3 months after the wedding. She was thinner, paler, and unmarried. Mrs. Whitfield's blacklisting had proven devastatingly effective, and the golden girl who had once danced 3 dances in a single evening now found herself struggling to fill a single line on her card. She stood in the entrance hall with her bonnet in her hands and her pride in pieces, and asked to see her sister. Clementine received her in the library. Her library, surrounded by the 3 years of books that told the story of a man's obsession. Georgiana looked at the shelves, at the desk positioned to catch the morning light, at the fire crackling in the hearth, and at her sister's face, calm, composed, wearing an expression that Georgiana had never seen on Clementine before, peace, and something in her expression cracked like ice in spring. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out broken, ragged, nothing like the bell-clear voice that had interrupted the conservatory moment. "I was jealous. I was cruel. I forged a letter in your handwriting and brought it to Mrs. Whitfield because I could not bear the thought that someone wanted you instead of me. I spent my entire life being told I was the beautiful one, the valuable one, the one worth investing in. And when the Duke of Beaumont looked past me as though I did not exist, I understood for the first time what you must have felt every day of your life. And instead of being humbled by that understanding, I tried to destroy the best thing that ever happened to you." She paused. Her hands were shaking. "I do not deserve your forgiveness." "No," Clementine said quietly. "You do not." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure would hold. Then Clementine poured her sister a cup of tea, and they sat together in the library, in the room built from 3 years of a man's devotion. And Clementine began, slowly, carefully, with the patience she had learned from a man who had waited 3 years to speak a single word, the work of rebuilding something that should never have been broken. It would take time. It would take honesty. It would take the kind of courage that both sisters had, in their different ways, spent their lives learning to find. Lady Viola, in her modest cottage in Hertfordshire, received a letter from the Duchess of Beaumont every month. They were brief, factual, and signed simply Clementine. They contained no warmth, they contained no malice, they contained instead something far more devastating to a woman like Lady Viola. They contained indifference. The daughter she had erased had not erased her back. She had simply moved beyond her into a world so vast and so full that Lady Viola's cruelty had become, at last, insignificant. And that, more than the reduced income, more than the social exile, more than the knowledge that her eldest daughter now outranked every woman she had ever envied, was the punishment that cut deepest. That night, after the guests had departed and the candles burned low, Percival found Clementine in her library, curled in the window seat with a volume of Wordsworth, the same edition she had been reading on the night everything changed. He sat beside her. She leaned against him. The fire crackled. The house was quiet. "You asked me once why I wanted the woman no one wanted," he said. "I remember. I did not tell you the truth, not all of it." She looked up at him. "Then tell me now." He was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything: title, power, control, until what remained was simply a man, sitting beside the woman he loved, telling the truth. "I was the youngest of 3 brothers. My father was the 6th Duke of Beaumont, and he was a man who understood sons the way a breeder understands horses, in terms of strength, stamina, and suitability for purpose. My eldest brother, Frederick, was the heir, golden, athletic, everything a duke's son should be. My second brother, Charles, was the spare, quieter, but competent, reliable. And then there was me." He paused. His hand found hers in the space between them. "I was small, I was quiet. I preferred books to horses and observation to action. My father looked at me and saw a mistake, a defective product that no amount of training could correct. He told me once, when I was 12 years old, that he was grateful he had 2 other sons, because I would have been a disaster as a duke. He said it at dinner, in front of the entire household. Clementine's hand tightened on his. When my brothers died, Frederick of typhoid fever, Charles in a riding accident, within 18 months of each other, I inherited a title I had never been raised for, and suddenly the entire world wanted me. Not me. The title. The money. The power. Every woman I met saw the Duke of Beaumont. Every man I spoke to calculated what my friendship was worth. No one saw Percival, the boy who read too much, who noticed everything, who had spent his childhood being told he was wrong for being exactly who he was. And then I saw you, sitting alone at a garden party, reading Wordsworth, chasing pages in the wind. And I thought, there is a woman the world has overlooked, the same way the world overlooked me. There is a woman who knows what it is to be invisible, to be deemed insufficient, to be told she is not worth the effort. If I can find her, if she can see me, then perhaps I am not as alone as I believed. You are not, she said. Her voice was fierce, certain, carrying the full weight of a woman who had spent 23 years learning to see what others missed. You were never alone. You were simply waiting for me to stand behind the right pillar. He laughed, a real laugh, rare and raw and beautiful, and pulled her closer, and the library filled with the warmth of 2 people who had spent their lives being invisible and had at last been seen. And that, my friends, is the story of the Duke who rejected 10 perfect brides and demanded the one no one wanted. The story of Clementine Pemberton, who spent 23 years being erased by her mother, by society, by a world that could not see past the grey silk to the extraordinary woman beneath. And of Percival Drake, the Duke of Beaumont, who had watched her for 3 years, collected her books, built her a library, and engineered the most elaborate courtship in the history of the London season, all for a woman the world had thrown away. This story stays with me because it asks a question I think we all carry inside us, whether we admit it or not. What if someone saw the version of me I hide? Not the version I perform for the world, not the polished, presentable, acceptable version, but the real one, the messy one, the one who reads too much and talks too little and stands behind pillars because it feels safer than standing in the open. What if someone saw that person and said, not change, not be better, not be more, but simply you? It was always you. Remember when I said at the beginning that this story would make you feel things? I hope I delivered. If it did, if your heart ached for Clementine standing behind that pillar, if it soared when Percival walked across the ballroom, if it broke when he gave her that key and she realized he had been building her a world before she even knew his name, then let me know in the comments. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me which line stayed with you. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every single comment, and knowing you are out there makes every story feel like a conversation between friends. And if you have not subscribed yet, join this community. I would love to have you here for the next story, because I am already working on it. And let me tell you, it might be even more intense than this one. Until next time.